Okay, welcome back. My name is John Sands. Again, we're covering Chapter 3, which is on authentication. So you'll recall in the first section we talked about basic authentication. In basic authentication, we use passwords to protect our devices. These are shared passwords that protect the device or modes that we want to change to within each of the devices. All right. At this point, we're going to look at a little stronger type of authentication. We call this local database authentication. We're actually going to create a local database in each device of usernames and their password credentials. Okay, so let's examine 3 different types of entries for the user database. In the first one, we can put in the command username followed by user. In this case, we'll use user01 followed by the command password, and then whatever we want that user's password to be. In this case, user01 pass. All right, now what the problem with this one is that password will be stored in the configuration in clear text. So if someone has access to the configuration file, they will be able to have access to our password and then gain access to our devices. To protect us against that, we could use the second type of command. So in this second command, you can see again we use username followed by the name of the user, in this case user02, followed by the command secret. So secret basically enables us to encrypt the password when it's stored in the configuration file. So if someone does gain access, they will not actually see our password. They will see an encrypted version of our password. And then finally what we can do is we can actually set a username, in this case username admin01, with an immediate privilege level. So we have privilege level 15 in this case, which means they're going to gain access to privilege level on the router. Our command in this case is secret, because we're going to encrypt the password, and our password in this case would be admin01 pass. All right, so if we were to take a look at these, okay, they're now placed on the router. Okay, and if we were to do a show run, okay, we can see these in here. So you can see the original one, the password's in clear text. In the second one, it created the user, but the password is encrypted. And in the third one, the username is in here, a privilege level is assigned, and the password is encrypted. Okay? So now what we need to do is apply this. So the way we apply it is we have to turn on the authentication process. So to do this, we basically go to the global config mode, and we type in AAA new model. And now what we're going to do is actually set the method that we want the router to use to authenticate our users. So in this case, we are going to basically just use, we're going to create a default method. So we're going to basically put in the command AAA authentication. Okay, then we want to follow that actually by the process, in this case it's login, and then whatever we want to call this login method. So in this case we're just going to call it default. And we want it to use the local database. Now there are other types of methods we can use, and if I do a question mark here you can see the different types. So we could use the enable password. We could use a outside server, which we'll get into in the next section. We could use one of the line passwords. We could have it case sensitive. In this case, we're just going to say local. All right. Now, if I follow that by the word none, what that would do is it said if we did not find that user base in the username in the local database, it would not require any type of authentication at all. So let's do that. So hit enter, and if I exit now, and I go to get back into the router, if I put in the wrong username, so I'm just going to put in user, it puts me into the router, so it didn't require any authentication at all. Okay? Now, if I put in the correct username, so user01, and then user01 pass, it basically, again, puts me into the router. Not a very protected means, but on a console port, it might be something that's used just in case, just to ensure that you don't lose access to the router. Typically, we might use a different form of that command, though. So what we might do instead is use this version of it, which is AAA authentication login default local. And what that does is if it does not find the name in the local database, it will not allow us access to the router. So let's show that. Okay, so now when we exit, it will not allow us in. So we have to actually put the correct password in now. So now I'll put the correct username. And it allows me in. So a little better protection, and that's probably the way you'd most likely do it. Okay? All right. The way we actually apply this method then, we have to go to our console, our line console. And in this case, we could put a executive timeout. Basically what this timeout here means is that if the line is not active for 5 minutes in 0 seconds, it's going to log us out, and we'll have to re-log in and re-authenticate. Okay? Then we have login synchronous, which is going to stop our entries from being interrupted from line changes, messages coming to the screen. And then here is where we actually apply the default login method to this interface. So login, authentication, default, that actually applies it to the specific interface. Right? So we may have different rules or different sources for different lines. For example, we could create another one. So we might use AAA authentication login default local and none for the console port. So if someone has physical access to the router, we want them to authenticate, but if not, they can get in. But from remote, we definitely would not want to allow someone in without authentication. So what we might do in that case is we might create a separate login rule for our Telnet users. So in this case, AAA authentication login, and we could just use the word telnet-list instead of default. So this is a second type. And in this case, we would only use login. So the credential would have to be in the local database or they wouldn't gain access. Okay? And then what we could basically do is now instead of going to the console, we're going to go to our Telnet lines. So in this case, Telnet VTY 04. We could put our executive timeout in again. So 5 minutes. If they're not in for 5 minutes, it's going to disable them, and they're going to have to re-authenticate. Or if we don't want a timeout, we can actually put 00 there, and that will not. There is no time expiration then. And then in this case, we are going to apply the new rule. So login, authenticate, Telnet list. So in this case, the Telnet list rule will be applied to our VTY lines, which would mean they have to be in a local login database or they're not going to gain access through a Telnet session to our device. Okay, that's the basics of local authentication. So again, just a couple of refreshers is we can have multiple rules. We can have multiple formats for the way that we enter usernames and passwords into the local database. And we can apply these rules to individual lines so we can control lines differently based on how we're providing access to the devices. Now the problem with this one is that we would have to replicate this on all of our devices. So if we were to have several dozen routers or hundreds of routers, it might not be a very efficient way to do it. So that'll bring us to the next section in which we talk about having a centralized database on a server, which would be much more convenient in a large network. So on a smaller network, this would work fine. As our network starts to expand, though, this would probably not be appropriate just due to managing usernames and passwords across all of our different devices locally. All right, so that finishes section 2 for chapter 3 on authentication.